Today, I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Sara Harrison with Earth Sciences New Zealand, a fellow Canadian that has been displaced living in New Zealand. And she's really been working with a really cool group. I just saw a presentation from her this morning talking about, not only the science side, but really how to communicate and make information about landslides, but landslide forecasts actionable and usable by end users. With that, Sara, I won't get too detailed, but if you would like to fill us any more on your bio, otherwise, this the floor is yours to tell us what you're doing.
Great. Thanks, Corey, and thanks, Lisa. Thanks both for organizing this, and thanks everyone for tuning in. It's nice to be here, and I have a beautiful view of Lake Wakatipu at the moment. I'm a hazard and risk social scientist at Earth Sciences New Zealand. So for those of you who might not yet be aware, Earth Sciences New Zealand is the product of a recent merge between what used to be GNS Science and NIWA. And we will soon also be having the Met Service, so our New Zealand Meteorological Service, coming into the fold once that acquisition is fully completed through Parliament. So that's underway at the moment. So that's just a little bit of context now. If you're not familiar with Earth Sciences New Zealand or you're wondering where GNS Science has gone, that's who we are now. So today I will talk to you about some research that I've been involved in under the Aotearoa Whenua Sliding Lands program. And this is specifically looking at evaluating some of the landslide forecasts that we issued as trial products in 2023 during the severe weather events. So just a little bit of an agenda for today. I'll do a little bit of context setting first with introducing the Aotearoa Whenua Sliding Lands program and what its aims are. And then I'll go through some context around those 2023 severe weather events and the forecasts that were issued by GNS Science at the time. And then I'll introduce the research questions and the methods that we're exploring to evaluate those forecasts, and of course, go over some of the initial results. And then I'll also unpick some interesting developments from the last few months as New Zealand has continued to be hammered by severe weather events that have triggered landslides. So this has given us the opportunity to put some of our research into practice to improve these forecast products. And then I'll cover off with some recommendations and some next steps for our future work. So to start, Aotearoa Whenua Sliding Lands is a 5-year research program that's funded by the New Zealand government. It began in October 2023 and it will be completed in October 2028. So we're about midway through the program. The aim is to provide consistent and robust national models that link rapid landslide susceptibility to landslide movement and runout through to individual, community, and property vulnerability and risk. So this is a really huge endeavor with a lot of people involved in the program. So our project is just a small piece of the puzzle, but it's an important piece as we've seen over the last few years with these increasingly severe weather events that I've just recently described. So this Endeavour program is led by Saskia de Vilder from Earth Sciences New Zealand and Emma Hudson-Doyle from Massey University at the Joint Centre for Disaster Research. So in 2023, New Zealand experienced what we now refer to as the North Island severe weather events. And it was essentially a chain of severe weather that continued to occur from January through till March that year. It affected mostly the North Island. So we had Cyclone Hale first, and then we had the Auckland Anniversary floods. And it's called Auckland Anniversary floods because the heavy rainfall event that triggered floods occurred on the public holiday that is the Auckland Anniversary holiday. Then shortly after that, Cyclone Gabrielle made landfall and affected a significantly large part of the North Island. Collectively, these events resulted in 15 tragic deaths. One person is still unaccounted for. It also produced 9 to 14.5 billion New Zealand dollars in damages. And it produced, Cyclone Gabrielle alone produced 800,000 landslides that are still being mapped to this day. So it was a significant event, and just the photos give you just a small idea of what happened. There is a coronial inquiry. A coronary inquiry was completed for following this event, these severe weather events, because of the deaths and the impacts. And so the outcomes of that coronary inquiry are still underway. And that's important information for later when I talk about our method for our research. But during these severe weather events, our team at GNS Science, so the Riskscape team, decided to issue some trial landslide forecasts to a group of stakeholders who had previously signed up for updates on the Riskscape platform. So Riskscape, if you haven't heard about it, the link is there on the slide, but it's essentially a risk modeling engine. And users can input their own data into the engine with vulnerability functions and then produce some risk modeling outputs. So in this slide, we have a very simplified pipeline that was used to produce these forecasts. So first we had the weather data, which was essentially the rainfall data that we got from NIWA. Combined it with the landslide susceptibility data that we have at GNS Science, and produced this landslide forecast. So this is the hazard layer. Then this was input into the Riskscape platform and overlaid with asset data. So in this example, it's the State Highway Road Network, and this is what we're calling the impact forecast, although it doesn't really account for damage, so it's more of an exposure kind of forecast, but we'll call it impact forecast for simplicity. So we have this one that was produced for the estimated number of landslides per kilometer of state highway, and then another one for the estimated number of properties per ward. So this is essentially an approximation of the number of properties that were essentially touched by a landslide, and then this was aggregated up to the ward area. So again, just to reiterate, these are the three forecast products, the three trial forecasts that we evaluated in our research. So these are only examples of what was issued. There were other ones that were issued as time progressed. As the rainfall model was updated every 6 hours, new forecasts were produced every 6 hours, and it continues to be that way to this day. But in our method, we only picked these three products, trial products, to test in our evaluation, and this also has implications for our results. So what did we want to look at in our research? These are four main research questions that we explored and that I'll try to address today. So the first question we had was who actually received the forecast? Because we know that people who receive the forecast via email, they might have sent them onwards to someone else. So we were kind of trying to track down who received those forecasts. And then of those who received the forecasts, who actually used them and what did they use them for? So we wanted to understand their use cases essentially. And then we wanted to know whether the users thought the forecasts were useful. So we asked our interviewees to rank the usefulness of the forecast on a scale of 1 to 10. And this was asked for both people who received the forecast and people who did not receive the forecast, but we asked them to think about hypothetically receiving the forecast in the future, how useful could they see them being? And then finally, what are the barriers and enablers to uptake? So if those who received the forecast used them, what was it about them that enabled them to use the forecast? And for those who didn't receive the forecast, for those who did receive the forecast but didn't use them, why didn't they use them? So we're interested in both sides of the coin there. So we ran semi-structured interviews with 25 individuals. from 7 different sectors or groups in New Zealand. You can see on the left in the chart the spread of our interviewees per group. It's not an even spread. We were limited with our recruitment. It was because this was a post-event evaluation, and the event did cause significant impact. It was deemed high risk by the Human Research Ethics Committee. And so because of that, we were limited with our recruitment strategy. We had to approach the CEO of the organization or their upper management and ask for permission to recruit staff from their organization. And then if they approved, we then had to ask them if they could put us in touch with the individuals they thought would be best suited to participate in the study. So that's quite a significant limitation for our recruitment, but it is what we had to do to align with ethical protocols. And I'm just going to take a sip of water. So in our initial sampling, we did focus on areas that fell within the forecast, but as time progressed, we expanded to those future users and potential users who might not have necessarily received the forecast because they were outside of the impact area, but could receive them in the future. So getting into the results, out of the 25 interviewees, 9 individuals could remember receiving the forecast. The remaining 16 interviewees either didn't receive them or couldn't remember. So we did have a couple that couldn't remember. Of those who received the forecast, 5 used them and 4 did not. So that's quite, a split. And we'll get into the reasons of why they did and didn't in shortly. When we asked interviewees to rank the usefulness of the forecast, this chart kind of breaks it down by usefulness per product at the bottom, if I can use my mouse. At the bottom, so we've got the hazard, the rain-induced landslide probability, number of landslides per kilometer of state highway, number of properties per ward, and then we've got the sector on the left. So not all interviewees were able to answer this question. So that's why the numbers don't exactly line up to 25 because of the semi-structured interview approach. But this is just for those who actually provided a ranking number. So we asked them to rank from 1 to 10 how useful the forecasts were or how useful they could be in the future, where 1 is extremely useful and 10 is not at all useful. So looking at this breakdown, all 3 forecasts received moderate usefulness rankings with a median of 6 out of 10. So they're not useful, but they're not extremely useful at the moment. But there are differences between the sectors, as you can see in the figure. So the perceived usefulness does appear to be sector dependent, and the emergency management group tended to rank the forecasts as more useful compared to other interviewees. So you can see in the graphic, they ranked the interviewee, the products between 2 to 3, which is pretty high on the usefulness scale. On the other hand, the government group of interviewees appeared to be less well served by the existing forecast. They ranked the products somewhere between 7 and 8 overall collectively. So there could be the reasons for this could be that the government sector potentially not super involved in emergency response situations, whereas emergency management is obviously involved in emergency responses, and so they could have seen the forecast as more useful for prepping and planning in advance. Whereas the government sector, I think they're more interested in that kind of long-term planning, long-term mitigation efforts, where these short-term rapid forecasts are potentially not that useful for. But that's something that we still need to unpack in our data. Another kind of difference we found in the data was the difference between those who received and did not receive the forecast. So those who received the forecast gave slightly lower usefulness rankings compared to those who did not receive the forecast. So those who did not receive the forecast perceived a higher usefulness than in their hypothetical thinking. And a really important point here is that these forecasts weren't previously introduced before the event. So they were a new product that was introduced during an emergency response. And kind of the overwhelming feedback we've had from our interviewees is that releasing a new product in a time of urgency meant that they didn't know what to do with it. They weren't trained on it. They didn't know how to fit it within their operational processes. They didn't know how to interpret the product. They were just completely unfamiliar with it. So that's really, really useful feedback for us to go back with and make sure that we kind of don't do that again. So then looking at each product individually, so we'll start with the hazard forecast. So this is the landslide probability forecast. We could pick out kind of the strengths and weaknesses of each of these products and then identify those areas for improvement. So generally, the strength seen for this product was that they communicate where the landslides may occur, and that's really useful. You can see the hotspots in the map. So the areas that are warmer color show a higher probability of landslide occurring than the cooler colored areas. But the problem is that they don't indicate the size or the type of slips. So it's really hard to make any kind of operational decision making with this product because it doesn't help them understand what kind of equipment they might need to pre-position for cleanup and for recovery. It doesn't help them determine whether any areas need to be evacuated, like actually how bad is it going to be. Another really significant kind of problem that we observed was that the users didn't really know how to interpret the probabilities. So you can see on the scale here that it's presented as decimal numbers. 0.17 is the max. And our interviewees essentially asked us, like, is 0.17 actually high? And they didn't know. So that makes it really hard for them to know if they can trust the product, if 0.17 is high enough that they require to act on it, or if it's low enough that there is no action required at this point. Another limitation is that it's not granular enough to support operational decision making, such as planning for evacuations or, like I said, pre-positioning, cleanup and recovery resources. So some improvements to this product could be to provide plain language explainers. What is this map showing us, as well as highlighting those kind of key areas that are at higher risk of landslide occurrence, which could then help the users kind of more clearly identify those hotspots and assign actions based on the information. A standardized interpretive scale would also be useful, and I'll get into that a little bit more in the next slide. And then another suggestion was to provide inset maps onto this static map, which zoom in to those hotspot areas to provide a little bit more of a granular look at what the situation could be. So communicating likelihoods came up as an area that really needs improvement for these forecasts, and it came up in our interviews, but we also saw it in the last few months as we've iteratively kind of tried to improve these forecasts in the last recent severe weather events. So if you look at the probability scale on this forecast, which was issued this year in January, you'll see the max is 0.2083. Previously, this forecast, which was issued in 2023, the max is 0.17, but the same red is applied to these different maximums. So this is a dynamic probability scale where the maximum isn't constant. And while it can help to identify relative hotspots within the current forecast, and that was the intent with this, it is difficult to see changes between the forecasts that are issued. So this forecast was issued at a given time. and then the next one will be issued 6 hours later. And presumably the maximum probability will change in that time. And so it's really hard to see differences between these forecasts if you want to compare them. So the same color doesn't always represent the same probability. And this is a problem because it can undermine trust. Users can perceive modest probabilities as overly intense, even just between the two products. 0.17 is red, 0.20 is red, but actually which one should we worry about more? So that was really an issue that the interviewees and the users identified. And this makes it difficult for them to act on the information. So while a dynamic probability scale can be useful for identifying those hotspots within the map relative to other areas in the map, if we're doing it for that purpose, it needs to be explicitly stated in the product so that the users can actually know how to interpret the results. Moving on to hazard on properties, the overall strengths identified by our interviewees was that it could support impact-focused decision-making with some improvements. So the limitations that were really identified and with our users was that the spatial aggregation by ward was a bit problematic because most of our interviewees were not familiar with the ward polygon area. They're more familiar with what we call statistical areas, which are derived from population. And so typically SA2, statistical area 2, is a very commonly used area layer for aggregation, for spatial data aggregation. So it's unclear to the interviewees and also to me as to why ward was chosen rather than SA2 area, which is more commonly used. And so that was picked up by the interviewees. Another problem that our interviewees pointed out was that these areas are not equal in area. And this could make it difficult to actually determine which areas are actually represented well in the map. So this is leading into this issue of urban bias. So in the map here, you can see the really dark area, which has, 400, estimated 400 properties per ward to be affected, is essentially the middle of Auckland. And Auckland is our largest population center in New Zealand. So the question that our interviews was asking was, is this actually representative of what we saw with the impacts? Or is it just because there's just a lot of buildings and the biggest population is in Auckland? But we know that in the north, in Northland up the north of Auckland, where you can see some slightly darker, like about 100 properties per ward based on the scale. This area is very exposed and vulnerable to flooding. It also has quite low socioeconomic status compared to Auckland. So if you factor that into the risk, the question is, was Auckland really at higher risk, or was the areas up in Northland really at higher risk? And this map doesn't actually show that well. So some improvements that could be made to this product is to actually have some indicators or indications of the severity and the consequence. So bringing in building damage, if we have the fragility functions available to us to actually run some proper impact modeling to then say this many buildings in the area will have this level of damage. Therefore, that's higher risk than this area. Potentially including socioeconomic data into the analysis could also help as well to account for that social vulnerability that I mentioned. And could also explore aggregating by equal area, or at least by commonly known polygons like SA2s. And then the third one is the hazard on state highways. So the strengths was that our interviewees saw that it really clearly relates to potential impacts, and they found this to be the easiest to interpret out of the three products, and therefore the most conceptually useful. but there are still limitations, of course. So our users said that they weren't able to discern or plan around road viability. So while the map shows us estimated number of landslides per kilometer of state highway, and it's really easy to point out this area here, which we call the Coromandel, the roads there were really hit by a lot of slips. But it doesn't actually tell us, were they big slips? Did they actually wipe out the whole road? Or were they just a bunch of little rock falls that still meant that the road is mostly viable? So that's another piece of information that our users were really keen to get more of. And another limitation is that this is only state highways shown on the map. It doesn't show local or regional roads, which is actually how most people get around. Now, the problem with adding local or regional roads, of course, is that the map will get way too busy to actually be useful. So a solution is to map priority local regional roads, which have been identified by the emergency management agencies, and we can get a list of those to help with our mapping. Or we can at least summarize impacts to these roads. And of course, indicating road viability would be super helpful to our users. And then the last kind of area for improvement, which actually applies to all of these products, is to enable flexible interaction with the data. So this could be in spatial data format like GIS layers, shape files. And I know that the hazard layer was made available as a raster data set to be added into our users' GIS platforms. It's unclear to me if these other two more impact-oriented forecasts were made available in that format as well. And there are also limitations around the raster data as well. And I'll get into that in a couple more slides. But so when we were asking our users about the use cases, so if they use them, what did they use them for, or what could they see themselves using the forecast for in the future? There were 4 use cases that came out in our interviews. So the first is risk assessment and awareness. So our users said that it did or it could help them to identify areas of heightened risk. Our participants from the insurance and infrastructure sectors said that these products would help for estimating producing rough loss and damage estimates. So they would essentially take the hazard layer and then put it into their own models, and then combined with their own asset data, essentially, and then produce their own kind of rough loss estimates and damage estimates that they would then use for their own operational decision making. Other use was to identify those possible impacts to communities. So the properties per ward could be useful if improved, and the roads as well was identified as a good proxy for impacts to communities and identifying potentially isolated communities. Another use was for advice. So we had interviewees from the science sector and from the emergency management sector who said that they used these forecasts to determine who they should send intelligence to or who they should send further advice to. And then an interviewee from emergency management also indicated that they used these products to determine whether or not they needed to produce public messaging. And in their case, they determined that their area didn't look like it was going to be significantly impacted by landslides. So they decided that they didn't actually need to produce any public messaging. The third use is response planning. So from the science sector, so we had interviewees who were actually involved in the science response. So a little bit of context here is that GNS Science has a operational role in response for particular natural hazards. We have a remit to monitor and provide science advice for hazards like volcano, tsunami, earthquake, and landslide. So we have our own response processes, and we were activated in the 2023 severe weather event. So at the time the individuals working in the science response used these forecasts to determine where they should send reconnaissance teams to gather aerial imagery of the landslides to help with landslide mapping, and to also build situational awareness to then inform their advice to National Emergency Management Agency and civil defense groups. And then it was also used to actually determine whether they needed to stay in response or not, in response mode. So we had an individual who was working in the response for the Auckland anniversary floods, I believe, or it might have been Cyclone Hale, I'm not sure. And then they saw the forecast for the next kind of severe weather event coming and then decided, okay, we should stay in response mode because this looks like it's going to be bad again. Emergency management interviewees said that they could see themselves, with the improvements made, they could see themselves identifying areas that might need evacuation. But we need to be really careful here because we've stipulated in some documentation with these forecasts that is quite new, that these forecasts are not intended to be used for evacuation due to the limited granularity. But potentially in the future, if they are improved, this could be an acceptable use, but it's just, I guess, an area of caution for now. But it also could be used to inform decisions around road closures and to plan for recovery. And then the fourth use was advocacy. So for advocacy in terms of gaining resources to support recovery. So we had a couple of interviewees who ended up either using the forecast to advocate for aerial imagery collection, and that was in the science response. And then we had another individual who didn't actually receive the forecast at the time, but upon seeing the forecast in the interview, said that these forecasts would have been really useful if they had received them at the time to help with advocating for funding and resources to support the recovery, because they could have said, look, these forecasts show that we're really badly damaged. And this interviewee, the agency that this interviewee is from in particular isn't well resourced, so they didn't really have their own kind of recon data that they could show as evidence to justify the need for support for recovery. And so this piece of information could have actually helped them build that case. So that's just something really important for us to keep in mind too, to ensure that our forecasts are actually reaching everyone that could benefit from them. So the flip side of the coin is the barriers to uptake. And so similarly, I believe, but we'll find out in my slides, four kind of themes emerged from our interviewees. So the first one was confidence, or the lack of confidence in these products. So when we asked interviewees why you didn't use them, or why might you not use them if you receive them in the future, there were concerns around the confidence with these forecasts because they weren't familiar with them. So for those who actually received the forecast, or those who saw the forecast in their interviewees and were impacted in the event, they saw some inconsistencies between what the forecast showed and what they observed in real life. And so that caused them to have low confidence in these forecasts. But something that we have to keep in mind when we're looking at these results is that it is possible that the impacts that they observed occurring actually occurred outside of the forecasted time frame in the products that we tested in these interviews. So like I said, 6 hours later was another forecast that was released, and we didn't actually include that in our evaluation methodology here. So it's just something for us to keep in mind, that while the forecast for the specified time that we tested for didn't show impacts happening or landslides happening, it's possible that a later forecast did show that. And so that's just something for us to communicate back to our users as well around that kind of validity and verification of these forecasts. And again, the other question was, because they were so unfamiliar with these products. How actually were the forecasts developed? What's the underlying data? What are the uncertainties in that? And none of that information was provided with these forecasts when we sent them out in 2023. Another barrier to uptake was the interpretation and the science translation. So releasing these new products in a time of urgency was, like I've already said, not the greatest thing to do, because these individuals were already going through high cognitive demand. Combine that with information overload and stress, and then add a new product onto that, it's not the best formula for success. Another key theme that came out was just the importance of science translators. So several of our interviewees identified key individuals from the science response who were incredibly valuable in actually being available to walk them through what the forecasts were saying and to translate what that meant in terms of what they needed to do for action and decision making. So that's just something for us to keep in mind, is that the role of those science translators, in addition to these forecasts. Another limitation was just the operational capacity. So that also relates to the fact that these products were so new. So we had interviewees who asked us, what do I do with this information? Because they haven't been trained on it. They haven't run exercises and scenarios with it to actually build it into their processes. And another issue was just the lack of, well, not lack of, but uneven capability across groups, across agencies in the country to ingest these forecasts and products. And so again, this is something that some training could improve on. And then that granularity and the value add was another kind of limitation that our interviewees noted. So the lack of granularity meant that they're not detailed enough to inform really specific response decisions. And we also had some interviewees who said that these forecasts didn't really add any new knowledge compared to what they already know about the landslide susceptibility in their area. They already know that these particular slopes are at risk of failure in a heavy rainfall event. So they already know to keep an eye on those in a heavy rainfall event. So kind of what new information do these forecasts provide is kind of what they were left with. Another question that we asked was really around what specific types of impacts our users wanted to see in these forecasts. And so we provided them with a list of impact types or kind of exposures. And the list is shown at the bottom of the figure. So we had buildings, impacts to like buildings, economy, health, infrastructure, impacts to the natural environment, impacts to people, primary industries, which is agriculture, and roads. And we asked them to essentially rank them relative to each other, where 1 is most preferred and 10 is least preferred. So in this figure, you can really see the darkest one is people. So people, aside from the insurance sector, people was ranked the highest. So impacts to people, and that included forecasting possible injuries and fatalities from these landslide probabilities. Followed by that is roads and infrastructure and buildings. Those are all pretty evenly tied. They're the next kind of 3 darkest columns in the figure. And like I said before, our interviewees actually said that, if we know the impacts to roads and buildings, that's already kind of an indicator of impacts to people and communities, because people tend to gravitate towards buildings and use roads a lot. And then infrastructure was another important one, specifically water, power, and telecommunications. That was identified as kind of the big 3 in terms of emergency management anyways. And so these are this will help us prioritize future work around what we should actually focus on for the kind of more damage modeling as this project progresses. And so I mentioned the formats briefly previously. So these forecasts are, at least the hazard ones I know, are sent out in two formats. They're sent out in these static PDFs that I've shown you, and they're also sent as GIS files that can be interacted with and ingested into the user's own GIS system. So in terms of the static PDFs, our users said that they're really good for a high-level picture and for rapid sharing up the chains. So for anyone who kind of works at that kind of high level, need to see the broader picture to inform big decisions and to essentially update the minister on what's happening, what the situation is, these static PDFs are very useful. But they do require supporting documentation, which at the time these products didn't have. The GIS files were seen as really, really good for zooming in. So the users who are actually more involved in the detail, involved in the more like ground level decision making, they really wanted to get their hands on the actual data so that they could zoom in and interrogate it themselves and overlay with their own asset data. At the time, and currently still is, provided these GIS files are provided as a via a download link in an email. And this has been identified as a barrier to entry because it requires quite a few clicks to access the data, unzip it from a zip folder, and then import it into their dashboard. So it's really desirable to provide access to these data sets using ArcGIS Online. That's the most widely used system in emergency management in New Zealand. Every emergency management group in New Zealand has an ArcGIS license. So this is how data is primarily shared. So it would be really good to make the data available through that platform. And of course, having good metadata and a user guide will also help with figuring out what the data is actually meant to be telling the users. I've gone on for quite a while. So we're at 5:45. How am I doing with time, Corey?
You're good. Keep going.
All right. Carry on. And then another kind of theme that came out is this kind of appetite for uncertainty. So you might have noticed in these forecast products that uncertainty wasn't really accounted for in the products. So we wanted to kind of explore that with the interviewees, how they felt around the fact that uncertainty wasn't really highlighted. So in our emergency management groups and in our insurance interviewee, uncertainty was generally preferred to be acknowledged in the products. And so we have one quote from an interviewee from emergency management who said that the uncertainty shouldn't stop the information from being shared because at the end of the day, the decision maker is going to have to make the decision on the information that they have available to them at the time. So the more information they have, the better. As long as, and if it is uncertain, that's fine, as long as it's communicated effectively. So the next key point is that communicating uncertainty must be done in an effective way to minimize communication. And so another interviewee backs that up. And they said that like the emergency management system in New Zealand has the ability to handle uncertainty, but it does have to be well communicated. And then other technical users, so this is our insurance sector interviewee, so that they do need to know the limitations of the forecast to support their own communications and analyses. So they said in their work, they're all about communicating the uncertainty, but people very often don't understand that models are models and that they're always wrong. So if we can communicate that in a useful way, then that can help with future kind of first and second users of either the data or the outputs to understand the limitations of it. And then the other group that we have analyzed so far, so we haven't analyzed all of the groups yet, is infrastructure. And most participants from the infrastructure group actually stated that uncertainty information isn't very useful for them, and that the products must relate directly to their decisions. So this is supported by a quote where the interviewee essentially says that they need some confidence that if you've got, if it's forecasting 1,000 landslides, they need the confidence that the top 1 to 20 are the most important landslides to focus on out of the 1,000. And they acknowledge that we're not going to get this right in the modeling and in the forecasting, but having some idea at the very least is helpful than having no idea. So that's kind of the takeaway for them. And then I just want to briefly go into kind of the new developments from the last few months as examples of putting our research into practice, because it's always nice to see this happen, although it's unfortunate that it's had to happen with all of the events we've had. So in the last year, these landslide forecasts have been in high demand, particularly by National Emergency Management Agency, NEMA. But there was a lot of confusion, like I said, around how do we use them, how do we interpret them. So earlier in the year, ESNZ co-ran a webinar with NEMA, and I believe NEMA actually hosted the webinar. And so the purpose of the webinar was to essentially provide more information around how these forecasts are developed and what's their intended use. So they were primarily users from the emergency management and regional, local, and district councils across the country. And the key questions that our research team tried to answer in the webinar was what they should know about the landslides and what signs to look out for. So that's less related to the forecast and more just generally landslide awareness and knowledge to help with public messaging. But then specifically to the forecasts, questions around what do the rainfall-induced landslide models capture, and how should the model be interpreted? Where should the models be used in response, recovery, and readiness? So again, what's their intended use and purpose? And are there any other resources that may be helpful? So that was the first 30 minutes of the webinar, and then another 30 minutes was dedicated to Q&A. I haven't heard any feedback on the webinar, but I do think it was a really good opportunity to start to increase that kind of knowledge and awareness of these products. I don't think it's enough as a one-off. Personally, I think we need to do a bit more, but I think it is a good start. And then what we also have now in our when we send out the forecast via email to our users, they now go to the National Emergency Management Agency directly, and then NEMA will distribute them to the regions. So that way we can ensure everyone who needs to get them is getting them. But in the email, this bullet point information is provided, which essentially just shows what do the forecasts show, and what do the forecasts not show. And then provided as an attachment in the email, and there are plans to make this available on a website in the future, but at the moment, this 3-page kind of information package is provided as an attachment in the same email, with that more contextual background information about the models. And so these 3 pages describe the models, the underpinning data and the inputs, the inclusions and exclusions in the modeling, and the limitations of use, which encapsulates who the intended users are and what the intended uses are, and maybe what you shouldn't use them for. So this is where we have stipulated for the moment not to be used for evacuation decision making because of the limitations. And like I said, this is provided as a separate email attachment, but in the same email as the forecasts. And another way that we are distributing the forecast information is in briefings with NEMA if we're activated in a response. And so we have this template that we've proposed to cover off kind of what the key points are that the forecast is showing. So which areas and regions have the highest landslide probabilities. And then, of course, the key information around the time of issue, what the map is showing, and the limitations. A challenge was identified by some of our staff involved in the response, though, recently, which is that filling out this template is quite time consuming because it changes per forecast, and so they have to update it every time. And so it's difficult to manually fill in under urgency. So there is an opportunity here to look at automating this process in the future. And then you'll notice in this very small figure that we have also fixed the issue of the dynamic probability scale. And so we have the probability shown in bins now, and this is standard across products. This is tied to the GeoNet probability translation table, and there's a paper, the citation is at the bottom if you want to read more about it around the development for this probability table. But this probability table is currently used, it's an operational tool. It's used for our other geohazards, primarily earthquake and volcanic activity. And so it helps to kind of translate what probabilities are in words, in likelihood terms. So we're using this at the moment as guidance for kind of binning the probability scale. So you'll see on the left that we started off with assigning the terms, those translation terms, to each probability bin in the legend. But the problem was raised that actually these verbal or text terms aren't suitable for the aggregated maps. So the maps that we send out it's really technical to describe, but basically the underpinning data is a 32 by 32 meter data set, and what we're showing in the map is an aggregation at 256 by 256 meters, which displays the maximum probability of that 256 by 256 meter area. So it was actually found that the probability terms or the likelihood terms aren't suitable for the aggregated maps. So as a kind of temporary solution for now, we removed the verbal descriptors from the legend, and we just have the probability bins, and then we have a text up here describing what the map shows, which is that it shows the chance of a landslide happening in a small area if rain is as forecasted over the next 48 hours. And then we've explained that to make it easier to see hotspots, the map shows the highest chance within every 256 by 256 meter area. It's a lot to wrap your head around, and we've had to kind of interrogate Chris Massey several times around this, but so that's kind of where we're at now, but we do need to do further testing, and we do plan on that in the next year. So very quick recommendations, which we're already starting to enact, is to provide more context and supplementary information to our users to help them know how to interpret and understand the maps, provide training and resources, and focus on key impact types for stakeholders that have limited capabilities. And I think I'm out of time, so I'll just leave it there. But yeah, thank you very much.